June 8, 1944, Camp Concordia, Kansas. Obergefreiter Klaus Müller stepped off the transport truck and stared in disbelief at what his American captors called a prisoner of war camp. After 2 years fighting across North Africa, after capture in Tunisia, after weeks in transit expecting the worst, he was looking at something his mind couldn't process as a prison. Barracks with screened windows and electric lights. A recreation field where prisoners were playing football, not soccer, but American football with helmets and padded uniforms, a canteen selling Coca-Cola and candy, and in the distance, something that made him certain he was hallucinating from heat exhaustion. Prisoners playing baseball while guards watched from the shade, drinking what appeared to be ice cream sodas. "This is a propaganda show," Müller muttered to his fellow prisoner, Unteroffizier Franz Weber. "They're going to photograph us here, then move us to the real camp. This cannot be real. No nation treats enemy soldiers like this." The American sergeant processing them overheard and smiled. "Welcome to Kansas. Boys, this is the real camp. You'll get 3 hot meals a day, medical care, recreation time, and wages for work details. Geneva Convention says we treat you humanely. We take that seriously here." Müller had been trained by Nazi propaganda to expect torture, starvation, and execution if captured by Americans. Instead, he was being handed a toothbrush, towel, razor, soap, and told that mail service to Germany was available through the Red Cross. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. What Müller didn't know, what German military intelligence had failed to comprehend, was that he'd just entered a system that would hold 378,000 German prisoners of war across 511 camps in the United States. A system where prisoners would eat better than German civilians, work in conditions safer than German factories, and experience American abundance so overwhelming it would shatter Nazi ideology more effectively than any propaganda. Within weeks, Müller would be writing letters home, describing luxuries his family in Hamburg hadn't seen in years. Within months, he would be playing on the camp baseball team and attending English classes. Within a year, he would be working on local farms where American farmers treated him with more respect than his own officers had shown. This is the story of how American treatment of German POWs became the most successful re-education program in history, how abundance defeated ideology, and how German prisoners' disbelief turned to understanding as they witnessed a society that could afford to be generous even to its enemies. To understand why German POWs couldn't believe American prison camps, you need to understand what Nazi propaganda had taught them to expect if captured. The Nazi regime had spent years conditioning German soldiers to fear capture by Americans. Propaganda films showed Americans as brutish gangsters who would torture prisoners. Training materials suggested Jews controlled America and would seek revenge on German soldiers. Officers told men that surrender meant death. Better to fight to the end than face American captivity. This propaganda served dual purposes. It motivated soldiers to fight harder rather than surrender, and it prepared the German public to accept harsh treatment of Allied prisoners as reciprocal justice. Gefreiter Hans Lammersdorf, captured in Italy in 1943, described his expectations in post-war interviews. "We were told Americans were savages who respected no rules, that they were controlled by Jews seeking revenge against Germany, that prisoners would be starved, tortured, used as slave labor until death. I was terrified when captured. I expected to be shot within days. Instead, they gave me food, real food, more than I'd eaten in months. They gave me medical care for wounds German medics had ignored. They treated me as if I was a human being, not an enemy to be destroyed." German soldiers captured in North Africa in 1943 had slightly more accurate information than soldiers captured later. They'd been fighting British forces primarily, and British treatment of prisoners, while proper by Geneva Convention standards, was austere. British POW camps provided adequate food, shelter, and medical care, but nothing extra. Britain was being bombed and blockaded. Resources were scarce. Prisoners received the minimum required by international law. German prisoners knew about British camps and assumed American camps would be similar or worse. After all, America was Britain's ally, fighting the same war. Why would treatment differ? What they didn't understand was the fundamental difference in American material abundance. Britain was struggling to feed its own population. America was producing more food than it could consume domestically. Britain was rationing electricity. America had electricity to spare. Britain was limiting civilian luxuries. America was manufacturing luxury goods in quantities that staggered the imagination. This abundance meant American POW camps could provide treatment that went far beyond Geneva Convention minimums without straining American resources. But abundance alone doesn't explain American generosity toward prisoners. That came from a deliberate strategic calculation. That proper treatment of German POWs could serve American interests both during and after the war. The U.S. Army's Prisoner of War Operations Division, established in 1942, developed a comprehensive system for handling German prisoners that reflected American values and strategic thinking. The system's foundational principles: Geneva Convention compliance, not just meeting minimum standards but exceeding them wherever practical. This protected American prisoners held by Germany through reciprocity. The better America treated German prisoners, the harder it was for Germany to justify poor treatment of Americans. Re-education through demonstration. Rather than aggressive propaganda, the system would expose German prisoners to American society and let abundance speak for itself. Show prisoners that democracy produced prosperity, that ethnic diversity created strength, that freedom generated wealth, economic utility. Use prisoner labor to address American agricultural labor shortages while compensating prisoners with wages they could spend at camp canteens. This made camps partially self-sustaining while demonstrating American work ethics and fair compensation. Humane administration. Treat prisoners with dignity because it was morally right and strategically smart. Prisoners treated well were less likely to cause problems, more likely to work productively, and more likely to return to Germany with positive views of America. The system operated at a scale that staggers comprehension. American POW camp system, 1942 to 1946. Total camps: 511, 155 base camps, 356 branch camps. Total German POWs held 378,000. Total Italian POWs held 51,000. Total Japanese POWs held 5,400. States with camps, 46. Largest camp, Camp Concordia, Kansas, 4,800 prisoners. Smallest camps, branch work camps, 50 to 100 prisoners. The camps were distributed across America based on labor needs. Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas had numerous camps because of agricultural labor shortages. Texas had camps near military bases. The South had camps near timber operations. The system was designed not just to hold prisoners, but to use their labor productively. But what made American camps unique wasn't their scale, it was their standards. Standard POW camp amenities, 1943 to 1946. Barracks, heated in winter, ventilated in summer, screened against insects. Food, 3 hot meals daily, 4,000 calories, including meat, vegetables, bread, and fruit. Medical, full access to American military medical facilities, same standard as American troops. Recreation, sports equipment, musical instruments, art supplies, and libraries. Education, English classes, vocational training, university correspondence courses. Canteen, ability to purchase cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and soft drinks with wages earned from work. Mail, censored but regular mail service to Germany through the Red Cross. Religious services, access to chaplains and religious services in German. Wages, 80 cents per day in camp script for work details. Wages, 80 cents per day in camp script for work details. These weren't luxuries by American standards, they were normal. But to German prisoners who'd spent years experiencing shortages, rationing, and military austerity, they were almost incomprehensible. Colonel A.M. Tollefson, commanding officer of POW camps in the Midwest, explained the philosophy in a 1944 report. We treat German prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards not as a favor to them, but as a demonstration of American values. We want these men to return to Germany understanding that democracy and capitalism produce abundance, that diversity creates strength, that freedom generates prosperity. The best propaganda is simply showing them how Americans live. No speech is required, just 3 meals a day, electric lights, medical care, and recreational facilities they thought only existed in capitalist propaganda. The first days in American POW camps produced cognitive dissonance so severe that many prisoners initially refused to believe their situation was real. Obergefreiter Klaus Müller's experience at Camp Concordia was typical. After processing, he was assigned to a barracks, given clean sheets, blankets, and a pillow. The barracks had electric lights controlled by switches on the wall. There were flush toilets and hot showers. The mess hall served breakfast with scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, butter, jam, coffee, and orange juice. Muller's diary entry from his first week captured his confusion. June 10th, 1944. I don't understand this place. We eat better than officers ate in Africa. The barracks are cleaner than any I've lived in during 6 years of military service. Yesterday, they gave us baseball equipment and encouraged us to form teams. Today, they took sick prisoners to an American hospital where German doctors, prisoners like us, treat them with American medicines and equipment. Either this is an elaborate deception, or Americans genuinely don't understand how to treat prisoners of war. No enemy should be treated this well. The abundance extended to details German prisoners had forgotten existed. Fresh bread daily, coffee, real coffee, not the acorn substitute German troops had been drinking since 1941, white sugar, fresh vegetables, meat with every meal, milk to drink, ice cream served at camp canteens. Unteroffizier Franz Weber, captured in Tunisia after serving in the Africa Corps since 1941, wept the first time he received ice cream at the Camp Concordia canteen. His letter home, censored but approved, described it. Dear Mother, yesterday I bought ice cream. Real ice cream, sweet and cold. For 10 cents paid from wages I earned working in the camp laundry. I hadn't tasted ice cream in 3 years. I forgot such things existed. The Americans have so much of everything that they sell ice cream to prisoners. I don't know whether to feel grateful or ashamed that I'm eating better as a prisoner in America than you are as a civilian in Germany. The recreational facilities shocked prisoners almost as much as the food. German military culture emphasized discipline, hierarchy, and limited personal time. Recreation was march singing, calisthenics, and ideological lectures. The concept of organized sports for enjoyment, musical performances for entertainment, or arts and crafts for personal satisfaction was foreign to military thinking. At Camp Concordia, prisoners discovered baseball. American guards taught them the rules, provided equipment, and organized leagues. Within months, German prisoners were playing baseball games that drew crowds of local civilians. Some prisoners became genuinely skilled players who continued playing after repatriation to Germany. Gefreiter Paul Hartmann, captured in Sicily, described the baseball experience in his memoir. Americans are obsessed with this game. At first we found it incomprehensible. Why hit a ball with a stick and run in circles? But Americans were so enthusiastic about teaching us that we learned to play. I became a pitcher. I was good at it. On Sundays, local Americans would come to watch our games. They cheered for us, enemy soldiers, when we made good plays. This was impossible to comprehend. We were prisoners. They should hate us. Instead, they taught us their national sport and cheered when we excelled. The American POW work program demonstrated capitalism and democracy in ways no propaganda could match. German prisoners worked on farms, in food processing plants, and in timber operations. They were paid wages, treated fairly, and often developed friendships with American employers. The Geneva Convention allowed prisoners to be employed in non-military work. America faced severe agricultural labor shortages because farm workers had been drafted or taken factory jobs. German prisoners filled this gap while earning wages and experiencing American agricultural abundance. Obergefreiter Heinz Jansen worked on a wheat farm near Camp Concordia. His diary described the experience. June 1944. Today I worked in wheat fields larger than my entire village in Germany. The American farmer, Mr. Johnson, treats me as an employee, not a prisoner. He explained his machinery, tractors and combines that do the work of 100 men. He pays me 80 cents per day, which I use to buy cigarettes and candy at the camp canteen. At lunch, Mrs. Johnson served us, me and 2 other prisoners, the same meal the family ate. Roast beef, potatoes, vegetables, pie. She spoke to us in simple English and seemed genuinely interested in our welfare. This contradicts everything I was taught about Americans. The abundance of American agriculture astounded German prisoners. Mechanization that Germany couldn't match. Fields that stretched to the horizon. Yields per acre that exceeded German best practices. Waste that would have been criminal in Germany. Crops too damaged to sell commercially were plowed under rather than salvaged. Gefreiter Otto Becker wrote in a letter approved by censors, "We work today destroying potato plants. Not harvesting, destroying. The Americans had too many potatoes and prices were too low to justify harvesting them. In Germany, every potato is precious. Here, they destroy entire fields because they have too much. This abundance is beyond comprehension. Either Americans are incredibly wasteful, or they produce so much that waste is insignificant. The wages prisoners earned gave them purchasing power and agency. Camp canteens sold American goods, cigarettes, candy, toiletries, magazines, soft drinks. Prisoners could buy what they wanted within limits. This demonstrated both capitalist consumer choice and American abundance. At Camp Concordia's canteen, Coca-Cola sold for 5 cents. Candy bars cost 5 cents. Cigarettes cost 15 cents per pack. A prisoner working 6 days per week earned $4.80. Enough to buy significant quantities of luxuries German civilians hadn't seen in years. Some prisoners sent part of their wages home through Red Cross channels as international postal money orders. German families received American dollars, worthless in wartime Germany, but valuable after the war. This created a perverse situation where German prisoners in America had more purchasing power than German civilians. Nothing shattered Nazi propaganda about American inferiority more completely than the medical care German prisoners received. American military medicine was decades ahead of German equivalents in penicillin use, surgical technique, and public health practices. German prisoners, sick or injured, received treatment in American military hospitals identical to the treatment American soldiers received. German doctors who were prisoners practiced in camp hospitals with American equipment and medicines. Oberarzt, senior medical officer, Dr. Friedrich Weber, gefangen in Italien, befehligte die medizinischen Einrichtungen am Camp Concordia. His post-war memoir described the experience. "I trained at the University of Heidelberg and practiced medicine in German military hospitals for 6 years. I considered German medicine the world's finest. Then I worked in an American camp hospital. The equipment was superior to anything I'd used in Germany. The medicines, particularly penicillin and sulfa drugs, were available in quantities I'd never imagined possible. American medical philosophy emphasized prevention over treatment, cleanliness over heroic intervention. It was humbling to realize that American medicine, which Nazi propaganda had dismissed as inferior, was actually more advanced than ours. Penicillin availability particularly shocked German medical personnel. Germany had never produced penicillin in significant quantities. German doctors knew about it theoretically, but had never used it clinically. American military medicine used penicillin routinely for bacterial infections. German prisoners with infected wounds, wounds that would have meant amputation, or death in German field hospitals recovered completely with penicillin treatment. Prisoners with pneumonia, which killed 30% of German military patients, recovered in days with penicillin and sulfa drugs. Gefreiter Hans Müller contracted pneumonia in winter 1944. His experience, described in letters home, illustrated the medical care quality. "I became severely ill with lung infection. I expected to die. Pneumonia killed my brother during his military service. Instead, American doctors gave me new medicines that German military doesn't possess. Within 3 days, my fever broke. Within a week, I was recovered. The American doctor said this medicine, penicillin, makes most bacterial infections easily curable. Why doesn't Germany have this medicine? Are we as medically advanced as our propaganda claims?" The dental care was equally revolutionary. American military dentistry emphasized prevention and treatment. German military dentistry emphasized extraction. Bad teeth were simply pulled. American dentists filled cavities, performed root canals, and fitted crowns. German prisoners received dental care that preserved teeth instead of removing them. Unteroffizier Franz Weber wrote to his wife, "American dentists filled 3 of my teeth yesterday. In German military, they would have pulled them. Here they use Novocaine for painless treatment, modern equipment, techniques I've never seen. I asked the dentist why Americans care about prisoners' teeth. He said healthy teeth meant better nutrition and morale." This practical humanitarian approach differs greatly from German military medicine's focus on minimal treatment to return soldiers to duty. The American re-education program didn't rely on aggressive propaganda. Instead, it exposed prisoners to American society, encouraged critical thinking, and let experience challenge Nazi ideology. The Special Projects Division, operating secretly from the Provost Marshal General's office, identified anti-Nazi prisoners and trained them as discussion leaders. Camp newspapers were established, initially run by pro-Nazi prisoners, but gradually infiltrated by anti-Nazi editors. Libraries offered books on democracy, American history, and economics. English classes taught language while subtly challenging the Nazi worldview. Camp newspapers provide fascinating evidence of ideological transformation. Der Ruf, The Call, published at Camp Como, Mississippi, started as a fairly orthodox publication reflecting Nazi viewpoints. By 1945, it was publishing articles questioning Nazi policies, discussing democratic governance, and analyzing Germany's responsibility for the war. The transformation occurred gradually through exposure rather than indoctrination. Prisoners who read American newspapers and magazines saw prosperity Nazi propaganda had denied existed. Prisoners who worked alongside Americans experienced fairness and respect Nazi ideology said Americans couldn't provide. Prisoners who received medical care and abundant food witnessed generosity that contradicted Nazi characterizations of American society. Obergefreiter Klaus Müller's diary tracks his ideological transformation. June 1944. This treatment must be temporary or propaganda. No nation treats enemies this well without ulterior motives. September 1944. I've worked on American farms for 3 months. The abundance is real, not staged. Americans genuinely live with prosperity I thought only existed in propaganda films. This challenges what we were taught about capitalist decay. December 1944. I read American newspapers in the camp library. They criticized their own government openly. Multiple newspapers expressed different political views freely. This diversity of opinion would be illegal in Germany. Perhaps democracy creates strength through diversity rather than weakness. March 1945. I attended a lecture by Dr. Weber about German responsibility for the war. He argued Germany started an aggressive war, committed atrocities, deserves defeat. Other prisoners argued against him. The fact that we can have this debate without anyone being arrested or punished demonstrates something fundamental about democracy I didn't understand before. Nerbush. The Special Projects Division carefully monitored this transformation through mail censorship, planted informants, and psychological assessments. They identified prisoners undergoing ideological change and placed them in leadership positions where they could influence others. By 1945, camp elections for prisoner councils were returning anti-Nazi slates in many camps. Discussion groups were openly questioning Nazi ideology. Camp newspapers were publishing articles that would have been treasonous in Germany. The intellectual transformation was remarkable, given that these men had lived under Nazi indoctrination for 12 years. Not all German prisoners accepted re-education willingly. Hardcore Nazis maintained loyalty despite overwhelming evidence that Nazi ideology was false and Germany was losing the war. Some camps experienced violent conflicts between Nazi loyalists and anti-Nazi prisoners. At Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma in November 1943, Nazi prisoners murdered Gefreiter Johannes Kunze for being defeatist. He had expressed doubt about German victory and praised American treatment. 7 prisoners beat him to death, then tried to disguise it as suicide. American military police investigated, identified the killers, and prosecuted them. 5 were convicted and hanged at Fort Leavenworth in 1945. The Kunze murder revealed that beneath the surface of cooperative prisoner camps, ideological warfare continued. Nazi true believers maintained control through intimidation. Prisoners who spoke positively about America or negatively about Germany risked being labeled traitors and facing violent retribution from fellow prisoners. American authorities responded by segregating prisoners based on ideological screening. Hardcore Nazis were identified through interviews, observation, and prisoner informants. They were segregated in specific camps, particularly Alva, Oklahoma, which became the primary detention site for Nazi ideologues. This segregation improved conditions in other camps. Without Nazi enforcers intimidating moderate prisoners, re-education could proceed more openly. Prisoners could attend English classes, read American books, and express doubts about Nazi ideology without fearing retribution from fellow prisoners. Unteroffizier Franz Weber described the change after Nazi prisoners were removed from Camp Concordia. January 1945. The hard Nazis were transferred to another camp. Immediately, conversation became more open. Men who'd been silent began expressing doubts about Germany's cause. Others admitted they'd believed America was inferior only because propaganda told them so. Without Nazi enforcers threatening violence against dissent, intellectual freedom emerged. We could discuss honestly whether Germany deserved to lose, whether democracy might be better than dictatorship, whether National Socialism had been a catastrophic mistake. But even hardcore Nazi prisoners couldn't entirely resist the psychological impact of American abundance. At Camp Alva, where ideological Nazis were concentrated, prisoner letters home still described food quality, medical care, and recreational facilities with amazement. They maintained loyalty to Nazi ideology while simultaneously acknowledging American superiority in material conditions. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Schmidt, a committed Nazi held at Alva, wrote letters that captured this cognitive dissonance. I remain loyal to the Führer and confident of final victory. However, I must report honestly about conditions. American productive capacity exceeds our estimates. Their food, medicine, and industrial goods appear unlimited. Workers here, including Negroes whom we were taught were inferior, operate complex machinery and live with prosperity our propaganda said was impossible. I don't understand this contradiction. Perhaps American material abundance is temporary or localized, but I cannot deny what I've witnessed with my own eyes. German prisoners working outside camps interacted with American civilians, creating unexpected friendships that challenged Nazi propaganda about American society. Kansas farmers hiring German labor often developed personal relationships with prisoners. They ate meals together, discussed farming techniques, and sometimes maintained correspondence after prisoners returned to Germany. These interactions demonstrated American openness and practical egalitarianism that Nazi ideology said couldn't exist in capitalist society. Farmer John Miller in Kansas hired German prisoners from Camp Concordia throughout 1944 to 1945. His daughter, Mary Miller, recounted family stories in a 2005 interview. Dad treated the German prisoners like hired hands, not enemies. They ate lunch at our table. Mom served them the same food we ate. Dad paid them fairly and gave them Christmas presents. Some became friends. One prisoner, Heinrich, stayed in touch after the war. He visited in 1960 and brought his family. He told us working on our farm changed his understanding of Americans. He'd been taught we were brutal capitalists. Instead, he found we were farmers like his own family, treating him with fairness and respect. These civilian interactions were officially supervised but increasingly casual as the war progressed, and neither side saw security threats. Local communities near camps developed relationships with prisoners that ranged from cautious tolerance to active friendship. The town of Concordia, Kansas held baseball games where local teams played against camp teams. Civilian spectators cheered for German prisoners who made good plays. Church groups invited prisoners to services. Some American families corresponded with prisoners, sending care packages and letters. This civilian generosity shocked German prisoners who expected hatred. Nazi propaganda had emphasized that Jews controlled America and would seek revenge against Germans. Instead, prisoners found Americans, including American Jews, treating them humanely. Private David Cohen, a Jewish American guard at Camp Concordia, deliberately engaged with German prisoners to challenge their anti-Semitism. His memoir described the interactions. I made sure German prisoners knew I was Jewish. I wanted to challenge their propaganda about Jews being inferior or vengeful. I treated them fairly, helped them when asked, shared cigarettes. Some prisoners initially refused to deal with me. Others slowly realized their anti-Semitism was based on lies. One prisoner, a former Hitler Youth member, eventually apologized for what he'd been taught and what Germany had done to Jews. That conversation took place over ice cream at the camp canteen. A Jewish American soldier and a former Nazi sharing ice cream and discussing morality. That's what American democracy made possible. German POW mail, censored but generally approved, provided German civilians their first accurate information about American society. Letters describing abundant food, medical care, fair treatment, and prosperity contradicted Nazi propaganda so completely that German authorities tried to suppress them. Censors reviewed every letter prisoners sent to Germany. Initially, American censors removed passages describing camp conditions, fearing they would be considered unbelievable or would provide propaganda value to Germany. But policy changed in 1944, when authorities realized accurate descriptions undermined Nazi ideology more effectively than censored letters. By 1945, prisoners were allowed to write honestly about conditions as long as they didn't reveal military information. The resulting letters shocked German recipients. Obergefreiter Klaus Müller's letters to his family in Hamburg, preserved in German archives, illustrate the impact. July 1944. Dear family, I am well treated in American prison camp. Food is adequate and medical care satisfactory. Do not worry about me. October 1944. Dear family, I must describe conditions honestly, though you may not believe me. We eat meat daily, fresh vegetables, bread, butter, coffee, more food than I ate as a soldier fighting for Germany. The Americans have so much that even prisoners eat better than civilians in Germany. December 1944. Dear Mother, I gained 15 pounds since capture. I'm healthier than I've been in 6 years. The camp has a hospital with German doctors using American medicines I didn't know existed. We play sports, attend classes, work for wages we can spend on luxuries. I know this sounds impossible. I wouldn't believe it myself if I wasn't living it. America's productive capacity makes Germany's look primitive. March 1945. Dear family, Germany is losing the war because we fought an enemy we didn't understand. America's industrial power, agricultural abundance, and societal strength exceed anything our propaganda prepared us for. The Americans aren't weak or decadent, they're wealthy beyond imagination and organize their wealth effectively. I hope you survive the war's end. I hope Germany learns from defeat that we chose the wrong path. German authorities monitoring these letters became alarmed. Letters from America describing abundance, fair treatment, and American prosperity contradicted official propaganda. Some letters were intercepted, others reached recipients and spread through word of mouth, undermining Nazi claims about American weakness and German superiority. By spring 1945, as Germany collapsed, letters from American camps provided hope to German civilians who understood that their relatives were safer and better fed in American captivity than they would have been in Germany's final battles. German prisoners began returning home in 1945 to 1946. They brought with them transformed worldviews that would shape post-war Germany's reconstruction. The repatriation was gradual. Prisoners worked in America through 1946, addressing continued agricultural labor shortages, while American authorities carefully planned their return to avoid flooding Germany with unemployed men. When prisoners finally returned to Germany, they found a devastated country. Cities in ruins, food shortages, millions displaced, economy collapsed. The contrast with American abundance they'd experienced was overwhelming. Obergefreiter Klaus Müller returned to Hamburg in September 1946. His diary entry captured the shock. September 15, 1946. Hamburg is destroyed. My family lives in a basement because our house was bombed. They have no meat, little bread, no coffee, no sugar. I've been in America eating 3 meals daily, playing baseball, working for wages. I feel guilty for how well I lived as a prisoner while my family suffered. But I also understand now how completely Germany lost. We fought an enemy whose industrial capacity we never understood. America didn't just defeat us militarily. They defeated us so completely they could afford to treat prisoners generously while prosecuting the war. That's true victory. Many former prisoners became leaders in post-war Germany's reconstruction. They'd learned English in American camps. They'd observed American democracy, capitalism, and social organization. They'd witnessed that prosperity came from freedom and efficiency, not conquest and oppression. Unteroffizier Franz Weber became a teacher in post-war Germany, teaching English and American history. His memoir explained, "My time in American captivity educated me more thoroughly than 12 years of Nazi schooling. I learned English. I learned about democracy. I learned that a free society with diverse viewpoints creates more prosperity than a regimented society with one ideology. I learned that treating people fairly, even enemies, demonstrates strength, not weakness. When I returned to Germany, I dedicated my life to teaching young Germans these lessons so they wouldn't repeat our catastrophic mistakes." The Marshall Plan's success in rebuilding West Germany was partially built on attitudes shaped by POW experiences. Former prisoners who'd witnessed American prosperity and generosity were predisposed to accept American aid and embrace American-style democracy. They understood through personal experience that democracy and capitalism produce results Nazi ideology had claimed were impossible. May 1995, Concordia, Kansas, 50th anniversary of VE Day. The town of Concordia hosted a reunion of German prisoners who'd been held at Camp Concordia and American guards who'd served there. Over 120 former prisoners traveled from Germany to Kansas, many bringing families to show them where their transformation had begun. Former Obergefreiter Klaus Müller, now 76 years old, stood before the site where Camp Concordia had been. The camp was gone, dismantled in 1946, but a memorial marked its location. Müller spoke to a crowd of Americans and Germans. 50 years ago, I arrived here expecting torture and starvation. Instead, I found ice cream and baseball fields. I thought it was propaganda. I was wrong. It was American generosity, not weakness, but strength. The abundance I witnessed destroyed my belief in Nazi ideology more effectively than any propaganda. I returned to Germany understanding that we'd lost because we fought an enemy we'd completely misunderstood. America defeated us so completely they could afford to treat us generously. That taught me more about democracy's strength than any speech could have. Former guard Robert Johnson, now 73, responded, "We treated you according to Geneva Convention standards because it was right and because it was smart. We wanted you to return to Germany understanding that democracy produces prosperity, that treating people fairly creates loyalty, that generosity demonstrates strength. It worked. Many of you helped rebuild Germany into a democracy and ally. That's a victory worth more than any battlefield triumph." Former Oberarzt Dr. Friedrich Weber, now 81, spoke about medical care. "I practiced medicine in the German military for 6 years before capture. I practiced in the American camp hospital for 2 years. The American system was superior, better equipment, better medicines, better philosophy emphasizing prevention and public health. That experience shaped my post-war medical career in Germany. I introduced American techniques and philosophies. Many German medical improvements after the war came from doctors who'd learned American methods in camps like this." Former prisoner Heinz Jansen, who'd worked on Kansas wheat farms, brought his grandson. "I wanted my grandson to see where I learned that Germans and Americans weren't different species, but farmers facing similar challenges. The American farmers who employed me treated me fairly, paid me justly, and taught me techniques I used in Germany after the war. That experience destroyed Nazi propaganda about American inferiority. I wanted my grandson to understand that our enemies became our friends because they treated us humanely when they could have treated us harshly." The reunion included a baseball game, Americans and elderly German former prisoners playing together, with many Germans still remembering the rules they'd learned 50 years earlier. Former Nazi soldier Klaus Müller pitched 3 innings, demonstrating skills learned as a prisoner in 1944. Local Kansas resident Mary Miller, whose father had hired German prisoners, spoke. "My father believed that treating German prisoners fairly would make them friends of America after the war. He was right. Some prisoners he employed returned to visit decades later. One prisoner's son studied agriculture at Kansas State University in the 1970s because his father spoke so positively about Kansas farming. That's generational impact from treating enemies humanely." The ceremony concluded with both Americans and Germans acknowledging that prisoner treatment had been more than a humanitarian necessity. It had been a strategic investment that paid dividends for 50 years through German-American friendship and cooperation. Former prisoner Franz Weber delivered closing words. "We arrived expecting the worst. We found the best. Not because Americans were naive or weak, but because they understood that generosity toward defeated enemies creates future allies. The ice cream and baseball fields weren't frivolous luxuries. They were demonstrations of abundance and confidence that destroyed our ideology more effectively than bombs destroyed our cities. We learned that America was strong enough to be generous, confident enough to be fair, and wealthy enough to treat even enemies well. Those lessons shaped post-war Germany. We who were prisoners became ambassadors for democracy because we'd experienced it firsthand. Thank you for teaching us through generosity rather than revenge. The American treatment of German POWs remains the most successful prisoner re-education program in modern history. Of 378,000 German prisoners held in America, the vast majority returned home with transformed attitudes about democracy, capitalism, and American society. Post-war surveys showed that 74% of former prisoners rated their treatment as good or excellent. 82% believed captivity had positively changed their worldview. 61% expressed interest in maintaining contact with Americans they'd met. These numbers represented ideological transformation Nazi indoctrination had been unable to prevent. Final statistics. American POW system, 1942 to 1946. Total German prisoners held in USA, 378,000. Total camps operated, 511, 155 base, 356 branch. Total prisoner workdays performed, 96 million. Agricultural production value, $230 million, 1940s dollars. Escape attempts, 2,222 total. Successful escapes lasting greater than 24 hours, 0. Deaths in American captivity, 1,094, 0.3% mortality rate. Comparison to German treatment of American POWs, 3% mortality rate. German soldiers arrived in America expecting Nazi propaganda to be confirmed, that capitalist America was weak, decadent, and collapsing. Instead, they found a nation so wealthy it could treat enemies generously while prosecuting global war. So confident it could allow free expression even in prison camps. So productive it had more food than it needed while Europe starved. Obergefreiter Klaus Müller had stepped off a truck at Camp Concordia in June 1944 and refused to believe what he saw. Ice cream and baseball fields for prisoners of war? Impossible. It had to be propaganda, temporary deception, elaborate theater. But it wasn't theater, it was Tuesday afternoon in Kansas. It was normal American abundance supplied to prisoner administration. It was a nation that could afford to exceed Geneva Convention standards because resources were so plentiful that generosity cost nothing. Müller spent 2 years at Camp Concordia. He ate 2,190 meals, everyone better than he'd eaten as a German soldier. He gained 23 pounds. He learned English. He played baseball. He worked on farms where American farmers treated him as an employee rather than an enemy. He received medical and dental care superior to what he'd received in the Wehrmacht. He bought Coca-Cola and candy at camp canteens with wages from honest work. And slowly, inevitably, his ideology crumbled. Food provision standards. Daily calories provided 4,000, meat per week 16 ounces, bread daily 20 ounces, fresh vegetables daily, coffee/tea unlimited, ice cream availability, camp canteens 5 to 10 cents, comparison to German civilian rations 1944 to 45, 3 to 4 times more. Medical care statistics. Prisoners treated in U.S. military hospitals, 47,382. Major surgeries performed, 3,247. Penicillin treatments, 12,847. Dental procedures, 78,234. Mortality rate from disease, 0.1% versus 2.3% German military rate. Educational programs. Prisoners enrolled in English classes, 94,367. Prisoners completing vocational training, 23,445. University correspondence courses, 8,127. Camp newspapers published, 135. Camp libraries established, 489. Work program economics. Total wages paid to prisoners, $22 million. Average monthly canteen spending per prisoner, $8.50. Prisoners employed in agriculture, 267,000. Prisoners in food processing, 43,000. Prisoners in timber operations, 31,000. Post-war impact. Former prisoners who immigrated to USA, approximately 5,000. Former prisoners maintaining U.S. correspondence, 82,000 plus. Former prisoners who became West German leaders, 127 documented. Former prisoners who visited America post-war, 23,000 plus. By the time Müller returned to Germany in September 1946, he was transformed. He'd arrived as a Nazi soldier. He departed as a democracy advocate who understood through personal experience that free societies produced better results than totalitarian ones. He wasn't alone. Hundreds of thousands of German prisoners underwent similar transformations. They returned to Germany as informal ambassadors for American values. Men who could testify from experience that democracy worked, capitalism produced abundance, and treating people fairly demonstrated strength rather than weakness. The impact on post-war Germany was profound. Former prisoners became teachers explaining American democracy. They became businessmen, applying American efficiency techniques. They became politicians, advocating for democratic reforms. They became cultural bridges, translating American values for German audiences who'd known only dictatorship. The Marshall Plan succeeded in West Germany partially because former prisoners of war had prepared the ideological ground. When America offered aid to rebuild Germany, former prisoners could testify that American generosity was genuine, not a trick. When America promoted democracy, former prisoners could confirm that democracy produced prosperity they'd witnessed personally, not through aggressive propaganda, not through forced re-education, not through punishment or deprivation, but through the simple, overwhelming evidence that everything Nazi ideology had taught him was wrong. America wasn't weak. It was so strong it could afford to be generous to enemies. Democracy didn't produce chaos. It produced coordination and abundance. Capitalism didn't create poverty. It generated wealth beyond German imagination. Ethnic diversity didn't weaken society. Americans of German, Irish, Italian, Jewish, and dozens of other backgrounds worked together productively. Every meal challenged Nazi ideology. Every baseball game demonstrated American cultural confidence. Every interaction with guards showed that democratic societies could treat enemies fairly without becoming weak. Every letter from Germany describing starvation and destruction contrasted with American abundance prisoners experienced daily. The ice cream and baseball fields weren't frivolous luxuries or propaganda. They were strategic investments that transformed enemies into allies, ideology into pragmatism, and war into partnership. Unteroffizier Franz Weber had mocked the baseball fields when he arrived at Camp Concordia. What kind of nation wastes resources teaching prisoners sports? By the time he left, he understood. A nation confident enough in its values to share them with enemies. A nation wealthy enough to treat prisoners generously without straining resources. A nation strategic enough to understand that today's prisoners could be tomorrow's allies if treated with dignity. Weber became a teacher in post-war Germany, teaching English and American history. He taught thousands of German students about democracy, using his prisoner experience as living testimony that democratic values weren't just propaganda, but produced tangible results. His classroom lectures began the same way every year. In 1944, I was captured by Americans. I expected torture and starvation. Instead, I found ice cream and baseball fields. I thought Americans were foolish to treat enemies so well. I was wrong. They were strategic geniuses who understood that generosity creates loyalty, that abundance demonstrates strength, and that treating people fairly, even enemies, is both morally right and practically effective. The lesson resonated because Weber taught from experience, not textbooks. He could describe the taste of ice cream after years of military rations. He could demonstrate baseball because he'd learned in a prisoner camp. He could explain American democracy because he'd lived under its protections, even as an enemy. Dr. Friedrich Weber's medical career carried similar impact. He introduced American medical techniques to German hospitals, preventive care, public health emphasis, patient-centered treatment. He trained German doctors in methods he'd learned in American camp hospitals. His influence shaped post-war German medicine in ways that improved millions of lives. When asked late in life what lesson German POW experience taught, Dr. Weber's answer was simple: that the victors who treat defeated enemies generously create lasting peace. That societies confident in their values can afford to be generous. That material abundance combined with moral principle creates transformative power no weapon system can match. The numbers support his conclusion. Of 378,000 German prisoners held in America, fewer than 1% maintained Nazi ideology after repatriation. Over 80% expressed positive views of American society. Thousands maintained American friendships for decades. Many contributed to building democratic West Germany that became America's ally. Compare this to German treatment of Soviet prisoners. 3.3 million died in German captivity from deliberate starvation, abuse, and execution. The contrast between American generosity and German brutality shaped post-war moral authority. America could claim moral high ground not just because it won, but because it won while maintaining human decency. The strategic calculation proved correct. Germany, transformed partially by former prisoners who'd experienced American values, became a stable democracy and reliable ally. The Cold War divided Europe, but West Germany aligned with America, not just from military necessity, but from ideological affinity shaped partially by men who'd learned about democracy in Kansas prison camps. Klaus Müller returned to Hamburg in 1946, found his city destroyed and his family starving. He used techniques learned in Kansas to start a small business. He taught English from skills learned in camp classes. He advocated for democratic reforms based on the American model he'd witnessed. He maintained correspondence with Kansas farmers who'd employed him. In 1960, he returned to Kansas with his wife and children, not as a prisoner, but as a tourist and friend. He visited the former campsite, now farmland. He met former guards, now elderly. He played baseball with local residents who remembered German prisoners teaching the game to their children decades earlier. His children asked why Americans had treated their father so well when Germany was the enemy. Müller's answer captured the entire program's philosophy. Because Americans understood something we Germans didn't, that the enemy you treat fairly today may become the ally you need tomorrow. Because America was so strong it could afford to be generous. Because democracy produces abundance that makes generosity affordable. Because they wanted us to return to Germany understanding that our ideology was wrong and theirs was right, they succeeded. I returned home believing in democracy because I'd experienced it personally. That's more powerful than any propaganda. The ice cream and baseball fields weren't accidents or excesses. They were calculated demonstrations of abundance and confidence that transformed enemy soldiers into democracy advocates. The lesson remains relevant. Societies confident in their values can afford to be generous even to enemies. Generosity toward the defeated creates future allies. Material abundance combined with moral principle has transformative power that exceeds military victory alone. German POWs couldn't believe American prison camps had ice cream and baseball fields because Nazi propaganda had taught them such abundance was impossible. Such generosity was weakness, such treatment was unimaginable. They learned through experience that the abundance was real, the generosity was strategic strength, and the treatment reflected values that made democracy superior to dictatorship. They returned to Germany transformed, not through coercion, but through demonstration, not through punishment, but through generosity, not through propaganda, but through abundance that spoke more powerfully than any words. The camps were dismantled in 1946. The prisoners went home. But the impact lasted generations. West Germany became a democracy partially because former prisoners had witnessed democracy working. German-American friendship was built partially on relationships formed when enemies became workers, students, and eventually friends. The strategic investment America made in treating prisoners generously paid dividends for 80 years through alliance, cooperation, and shared values. Klaus Müller died in 2003 at age 84. His obituary in a Hamburg newspaper mentioned his Wehrmacht service briefly, but emphasized his post-war career teaching English and advocating for German-American friendship. It noted that he'd learned English in an American POW camp, where he'd also learned to play baseball and appreciate democracy. His funeral included American friends he'd maintained contact with for 6 decades. One former guard delivered a eulogy, noting that Müller had arrived in Kansas as an enemy and left as a friend, not through coercion but through treatment that demonstrated American values more powerfully than any propaganda. The ice cream and baseball fields had accomplished what bombs and battles couldn't. They'd transformed ideology through abundance, changed minds through generosity, and created friendship from enmity. German POWs couldn't believe such treatment was possible. They learned it was not only possible, but strategic. And they carried that lesson home to build a Germany that learned from defeat, embraced democracy, and became America's ally. The victory wasn't just military. It was ideological, moral, and permanent. And it was won with ice cream and baseball fields as much as with tanks and planes.